I call the honourable member Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak in support of Mr Mallard's motion, and I'm going to make 3 points around the 3 parts of the motion. The first part of the motion is the notion of an instruction to the Committee of the House. The second part of the motion is around the question of that instruction being the reconsideration of Part 1, and then the third part of the motion being the specific amendment for which there would be a motion of reconsideration. To talk to the first of those 3 elements of Mr Mallard's motion, the instruction to the Committee of the House, it is unusual for the Parliament to issue an instruction to the Committee of the House. The Committee, as most members will be aware and people watching may be aware, operates quite independently from the operations of this House when we sit here with the mace in place ready to do our work as a Parliament. We act as a committee, and in order for this Parliament, as acting as it is now with the mace on the table as the Parliament, to issue an instruction, as Mr Mallard is asking in his motion, is unusual. That is because the business of the Committee of the House normally takes place in an orderly fashion and in such a way that it proceeds through and returns to us with a report from the committee on the activities of the committee back to this House. But the reason why an unusual event like this occurs for an instruction is often when something occurs between when the committee deals with something and then when the House comes next to deal with the matter. And that is precisely the situation we find ourselves in today, where it's necessary to undertake the unusual move of instructing the committee because in the time since the committee dealt with Part 1, the Prime Minister has made a very definitive statement about the meaning of a clause within Part 1, Clause 8A of the bill within Part 1. He has made a very definitive statement. That definitive statement was not made before the House, before the committee rather, considered Part 1. So the unusual experience of, and I can see it's disturbing for Mr Brownlee, but the unusual experience of the House issuing an instruction to the committee has to be justified. It's not something we would undertake lightly, Mr Speaker, but we do so because there has been a significant development in the meaning and the interpretation of a clause within Part 1, and therefore Mr Mallard's motion to move an instruction to the committee is justified in this instance, in my point of view. The question then in the instruction is, should we reconsider Part 1? Now, just to recap, and it is important to do this, that Part 1 of this bill is the substantive section of this bill. It is the part of the bill that amends the GCSB Act. The other 2 parts of the bill actually amend other acts. So Part 1 is the substance of this bill. And the section that is addressed within the SOP is around the functions of the GCSB. So it's absolutely core to the purpose of this legislation, to the whole legislation itself. This is not a trivial matter we're asking to be reconsidered by the committee. It is the core of the functions of the GCSB. And so when we are issuing here the idea to consider Part 1, the only way that we can provide clarity about an essential part of this bill is to go back and reconsider Part 1. We are unable now, as we are in the Committee of the House up to Part 3, to amend Part 1. There is only one option for this, and that is to go back and reconsider Part 1. Because when we were considering Part 1, there was no definitive statement in the public arena of the fact that the content of New Zealanders' communications, including emails, were not able to be looked at under Section 8A. That statement was made by John Key to Audrey Young. Jerry Brownlee interjects and says it's in the bill. It is not in the bill. That's the whole point of this exercise. It is not in Section 8A. It does not make that clear. It is not in Section 15A. It is not in Section 15C. It is nowhere in those places. And when John Key makes a definitive statement that New Zealanders' communications, the content of them, cannot be accessed, we, on this side of the House, say, all right, put it in the law. Don't just say it to Audrey Young in an email, Put it in the law. Make it clear. And it is not in the law, Mrs. Tolley. It is not in the law. What clause? What clause is it in, Mrs. Tolley? What clause? She can't answer because it's not. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, that is why we have to ask the Committee of the House to reconsider Part 1, because the Prime Minister has moved from a situation when this committee was originally debating Part 1, where there was no definitive statement about whether or not the content of New Zealanders' communications and email, including emails, would be possible. He made those statements after the committee went through Part 1, and then said it on television after Part 1 had been debated. He then repeated it. It was then printed in the newspaper on the basis of a written email, a communication from John Key to Audrey Rudd. That is new information about Part 1. And that means that the Committee of the House has not been able to fully consider Part 1 when the committee went past that last week. So that is why our submission and Mr Mallard's motion says that we should be reconsidering Part 1. It is not good lawmaking, Mr Speaker, for this House to find out that there's something definitive. About Part 1 that's not expressed in the law at this time. And Mr Mallard and others have already mentioned the fact that Mr Key has subsequently said that he will make statements in the third reading speech and that will make sure that the interpretation of Part 1 is clear. Well, Mr Speaker, that is not good lawmaking. It is a far better practice and a far clearer practice to write down in law what is meant. And the Prime Minister could not have been more definitive, Mr Speaker, over the weekend when he said the content of New Zealanders' communications would not be accessed as a result of Section 8A. He made that clear after the House had gone through Part 1, and we on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, submit that that means we should be reconsidering Part 1 because we cannot do that. Jerry Brownlee's found 8CA. I very, very much doubt 8C could have anything to do with this because that's not about cyber security, Mr Brownlee. It's not. 8C is about assisting other agencies. It's a different clause, Mr Brownlee. 8C is a different clause. We're talking about 8A. Mr Brownlee has no idea about the structure of this bill whatsoever. No idea. 8A, cyber security. 8B, the foreign intelligence function. 8C, assisting other agencies, Mr Brownlee. Yes, it is. That's what it is. Jerry's wrong once again. Mr Speaker, I come to the third point, which is the specific amendment that is included in Mr Mallard's motion. The need for the specific amendment is because the people of New Zealand have been told by John Key that we have to trust him in order for their communications, including emails, to be protected. Mr Mallard's motion says we need to consider the SOP from David Shearer that says just having someone like John Key say, trust me, isn't good law. What we need in the law is a statement, and David Shearer's SOP begins with the words, for the avoidance of doubt. And it's quite clear that there is considerable doubt. John Key claims it's all fine. Trust him, the content of communications will not be looked at. The Law Society, Geoffrey Palmer, all sorts of other people have come forward and said we are seriously concerned here about whether the content of New Zealand's communications, including email, can be accessed. This SOP, covered by Mr Mallard's motion, says for the avoidance of doubt, let's say once and for all that the content of New Zealanders' communications is not covered under Section 8A. That is a perfectly reasonable suggestion to go back and do something that apparently the National Party already agrees with. Well, for the avoidance of doubt, let's put that into the law. Mr Mallard's motion should be supported. The committee should reconsider Part 1 because John Key can't make up the law as he goes along.
Mr Speaker.
I call the honourable member Louise Upston.
I move that the question be now put.
I'm going to hear from the honourable member Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. New Zealand First